I'm going to tell you about the birth of the Albanian Evangelical Mission and its early development, ministry and expansion, and something of its ministry today. As far as I know, it is still the only mission devoted only to the Albanian people. I view the beginning of the mission as having started at a prayer meeting in 1976 held in that house in Kent called Korçë, when 10 people gathered to pray for Albania. And as far as I know, that was the first prayer meeting held specifically for Albania during those communist years. It was advertised in the Christian press, and people came to pray specifically for Albania, not to form a mission, just to pray. The prayer movement grew, and conferences began to be held, weekend conferences. First of all in 1979, then there was a gap, and then from 1983 onwards they were held every year in a conference centre in one place or another. There you see the people who gathered one year. The conference met at Clovelly Hall in Shropshire in 1984, and I spoke at that conference, and I suggested that an organisation, a body, should be brought together which would channel all its personnel, resources, finance, planning only into bringing the gospel to the Albanian people. The idea was therefore mooted publicly in 1984. It was founded in 1986. One of the early ministries that was possible before Albania opened up was visiting radio listeners. There was a radio evangelist called Salih Rahmani who was preaching the gospel over the radio, and it was possible to correspond with listeners and to go and visit them and ask if they had questions, offer them more literature, and simply talk with them. This was done in Montenegro, Kosova, Macedonia, and Germany, maybe elsewhere, but certainly in those places. There was also the possibility of personal evangelism, both by speaking to people and by handing out free evangelistic tapes produced by Salih Rahmani. Here you see me in the town of Tihero in Greece. I was told that 80% of the population were Albanian speaking, and there are other places in Greece where Albanian is or was a language spoken by many people, and therefore it was possible to go to those places. The police came when my fellow traveller and I had been in Tihero, and they told us to leave the area. And when I wrote to the Greek embassy in London and asked about the location of Albanian-speaking villages in northern Greece, I received a reply telling me that there were no such places. There was a church founded in Kosova, an Albanian church, and it was possible also to visit them, to encourage them, and that was also done during those years. But visiting Yugoslavia, which was a communist country, was not without its difficulties, and I remember that my cutlery was confiscated at the airport when I was due to fly home and put in a bag labelled arms to be retrieved from the airport police at Manchester. I don't think that I could really have hijacked a plane with perhaps a knife or fork or spoon to eat watermelon with. I suspect it was in order to be intimidating, at least that was a large part of the motivation. In 1989, the first missionary was commissioned, and he went to serve in Kosova, and here you see him, Mike Brown. And he worked with that church which I told you about just now. Yugoslavia was not at all easy for the missionaries, and here you see a book called Kill Your Neighbour, and you will see Mike Brown's name underlined as one of the people who were accused of being covert workers for the CIA. A few months later, there was a mass rally at this place in Kosova. Slobodan Milosevic preached to them. I say preached because it was a very fervent nationalistic message to the Serbs, stirring up their desire that Kosova should be part of Serbia and commemorating a battle which they lost there in 1389. 1 million Serbs turned up and heard this very stirring speech, stirring up their nationalism, and it could be regarded as the lighting of the fuse, which led to civil war sometime later. Turning our mind to Albania again for a while, we had correspondence and face-to-face contact with this couple who had been missionaries in Albania from 1932 to 1940, Edwin and Dorothy Jacques. And they gave us a lot of information about the pre-war ministry that had gone on, with plenty of photographs to illustrate it. Here you see Nicolaceno on the left, up above Shkodër, where there was an evangelistic outreach. Here you see a youth group up in the hills somewhere, probably near Korçë. Here you see two of the workers outside a mosque in Tirana. Here you see up on the top left some village evangelism and other youth activities, and down in the bottom the people with the bicycles, they went out to the villages to do evangelism because there was a thriving evangelical church in Korçë at that time. As far as we know, it was the only evangelical church in the whole of Albania. And here you see the pastor, Korçë, and the dates when he lived. His father had been burnt to death by Greek invaders. He was imprisoned under the Muslim king. He was interned by the Italian invaders, and he was imprisoned and tortured by the communist regime. But he remained faithful. And here you see him in 1990, in the middle, with two other believers, Ligor and Kristac. And that is all that remained of that thriving church. There may have been others who believed in their hearts, but these were the only three who continued all the way through the communist years to meet. And then in June 1991, the communist regime fell, and Albania opened up once again to the possibility of evangelism and church life. One of the first things was an evangelistic mission that was held in the football stadium in Tirana, and we took part in that. And immediately following, Mike Brown, the missionary, and I went down to Korçë, and Mike had been invited by the believers in Korçë to lead that church and get it re-established. It's worth noting that we went by invitation of Albanian believers. We didn't just come and present ourselves. Here is their church as it was then, the premises with schoolrooms. I believe it had dormitories, preaching hall, and that is what had become of it. Abandoned, neglected. It had been inhabited for a while by squatters. They did eventually manage to get it back, and there is now a beautiful new church built on that site. So that was in the summer of 1991. By February 1992, Mike Brown had managed to increase the congregation, and here you see some of them gathered one day in February. We engaged in the distribution of aid. Here you see us at the village called Kumbathekar, and people were so pleased. Even though it was a Muslim village, they invited me to be the village priest, although I didn't feel it was my calling, and I declined the invitation. Usually the aid that we took targeted smaller and individual needs. For example, here is a grocer who wanted to re-establish or build up his business, and two of us, having purchased that vehicle with money which he gave to us very trustingly, drove it out to Albania for him so that he could get his grocery work developed. We were involved in running orphanages in Berat and in Elbasan, and we produced books for Christians to point them to Christ, to know him and love him more, or for non-Christians to point them to Christ that they might come to know him. Some were translated, like the one on the left. Some were written in English, like the one on the right, which is about overcoming doubt. And that is actually available in its English original as well. We produced books about Albania and the Albanian people, both for Albanians so that they could know more about the Protestant movement amongst them over the years and how it had been well received, and also books in English about Albania and the Albanians to arouse people's interest. When we translated things, we always used native speakers. We didn't have an English person who had learnt Albanian. We always used native speakers. You see too, Bella and Bona in the photograph. We used Holger Dashi, we used Hilki Berisha from Korçë and Pristina respectively, and a range of other competent translators. We engaged in church planting. Here you see one of the missionaries, Sean Thompson, going door-to-door visiting in Gjirokastër on the left, and there on the right you see some of the people involved in the church plant in a place called Bilisht, outside the building that was used for the meetings. There was the Timothy Project, which began in 2002 by missionary Sean Thompson. The idea was to train up Albanian workers so that they could then become leaders. And here you see the first of his Timothys, Geni Dogani, standing outside the building which they rented, and the church was called Kisha Drita Ibotus, the Light of the World Church. Summer camps became very important and still are for young people, but not only young people. There are gatherings for the blind, for women, for families. This one was in Borș. And we continued to encourage prayer and to maintain contact with as many prayer groups as we could that were meeting around Britain to pray for the Albanian work. I mentioned the war in Kosova, which broke out in 1998, and there were many refugees who flooded into Albania from Kosova. There you see some of the destruction that was wrought in the village of Majunaj on the left, and on the right you see a couple of the refugees who were cared for by missionaries in Gjirokastër. And after the war, one of the missionaries, Jeff Townsend, arranged help from builders or plasterers or painters and decorators, whatever he was able to find that was appropriate, and he got them to go over to Kosova and start rebuilding people's ruined homes. Here you see a farmhouse in Suarec. There are Albanian speakers in Sicily, and we also visited them. You see there an Italian brother called Gerardo. In the front, in the blue shirt, you see Femi Tsakoli, the first Albanian pastor ever to have visited them. He is from Pristina, and you see some of the congregation with myself standing next to the pastor, who is the man in the middle row on the far right of the photograph. Now, much more has happened, and much more does still happen. There is literature about the work in the form of books, and there are regular bulletins, and you can contact the mission with a view to finding out more. and here is how you do so. You go onto their website, and from there you can pursue your interest in whatever way you wish.